Hello, I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story. Our goal is always to help you grow as a more confident, compelling, and persuasive storyteller so that you can accelerate the growth of your revenue, your people, and your career. That's why I'm so happy you're with us today as we explore the art of influential communication with Ty Bennett, author of the terrific book, The Power of Storytelling. Why? Because we simply want you to excel through the stories you tell. What I enjoyed most about my conversation with Ty is how he underscores the hugely important point that you don't have to tell epic Spielbergian stories to grow your influence. In fact, it's often the simple and compelling personal anecdotes that win over your audiences.
Some of the stories that are most impactful are just little insights, right? I mean, I tell stories on stage of like an insight my 3-year-old gave me. Like, it's not profound, it's not earth-shattering, it's cutesy. But if you tell it well, you can learn how to engage people, and there's a reason for telling those types of stories. I also would tell people that the more personal a story is, the more powerful it becomes.
Ty Bennett is the owner and CEO of the largest Ninja Warrior gym in the world, and it's not stopping there. Soon he will have 3 Ninja Warrior gyms to add to his portfolio. An active CEO and serial entrepreneur, he has built 3 multi-million-dollar businesses in 3 different industries. Ty and his brother built a direct sales business to over $20 million in annual revenues while in their 20s, and developed a system and organization that would help over 500 leaders fine-tune their sales and leadership skills in over 37 countries. He was featured as one of the top 40 under 40 and dubbed one of the 10 coolest entrepreneurs in Utah, of all places. Ty has founded Leadership Inc., a training company with a mission to empower individuals and organizations to challenge their status quo, cultivate exceptional relationships, and compete in extraordinary ways. He is the author of 3 best-selling books, which are used in graduate courses at multiple universities, including MIT. They include Partnership is the New Leadership, The Power of Influence, Increase Your Income and Personal Impact, and of course, what we're covering today, The Power of Storytelling, the Art of Influential Communication. He has traversed the world speaking to tens of thousands of audience members, transforming the lives, careers, and business practices of leaders from some of the most recognizable brands in the world, such as Coca-Cola, Subway, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Remax. Today, you'll learn his formula for an influential story, how to bring your audiences into your story, and tools to make your stories come alive. Please welcome to the Business of Story, Ty Bennett. Hello, Ty, and welcome to the Business of Story.
Thank you for having me.
Charles Good at the Institute of Management Studies suggested I have you on, and I'm so glad he did. I know you were just recently on their great podcast there. So
yeah, Charles is a great guy. Glad he could connect us.
You are in the storytelling world like so many of us, and it looks like by reading your bio and so forth, you kind of cut your teeth in it at an early age in the direct sales world, which
Yes.
I was introduced to the direct sales world about 10 years into my career as I went in and was creative director for a company that you may or may not remember called Quorum International.
Okay. I remember the name. Yeah.
Yeah, and I learned so much about that form of marketing and how it was so story based. Have you heard of the guys like Eric Worre and
Yeah.
Jeff Olson? They were running the organization at the time. And Ty, I'll never forget when they came in to kind of take the reins over to help build it. They assembled all of us in a conference room, all the marketing folks, all the creative folks, and so forth. And they went on for about an hour and shared their backstory and how they got involved with Quorum. And I will never forget that day because it was the first time that I really was, without realizing it, exposed to the power of story in marketing. I think in the back of my mind, I was intuitively already doing it, but these two guys absolutely owned that room and were inspirational and interesting. And I left that room a changed guy. I was like, wow, that is some amazing storytelling. Now, have you had that same experience in your world?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I know both of those two. I know Eric better, but yeah, incredible storyteller, very charismatic, engaging, and so I can imagine what that event was like for you. And similar for me, I was exposed to in had a chance to hear incredible storytellers, had a chance to learn from them, was inspired by them. And then as I was developing our business, found more and more that that was the skill set I kept falling back to and wanted to enhance. In fact, what really opened my eyes to it was I started to record every time I was giving a presentation as I was trying to build my business. And I'd go back and listen to those, and they were painful to listen to. They were so hard, right? I'd said so many times, and I just wasn't confident, wasn't clear. But as I started to get a little better, and I started to have some success, the question I would ask was, what caused people to engage? As I would listen, as they would, lean in, laugh, engage a little bit more, ask more questions. What was I doing? And inevitably, I was telling stories. And so that was like an aha moment for me to go, let's focus on that. Let's get better at that. And so I started to study great speakers, salespeople, and look at it from the angle of storytelling. Like how do they tell stories? What are they doing? Tried to pick up books on storytelling, just anything I could. And that skill set changed things for me. We were able to build a very successful, $25 million a year business in our 20s, and led me into the world of speaking and writing, and eventually writing the book, The Power of Storytelling. But that for me was the realization, probably kind of where you saw it, just the same way of like, that skill set works. There's nothing like it. It just grabs people and moves people in a way that nothing else can.
I remember they brought in a distributor at the time from Europe, and he came into Phoenix, Arizona. And it was the first time I'd seen storytelling in action from a marketing distributor's point of view. And he told this unbelievable rags to riches story of where he had lost literally everything. And he was living in what amounted to a closet at a friend's house. And he had a wife and a child to feed, and they were living
Wow.
with her sister. And he was trying to figure out what in the heck he was going to do next. And then he found the Quorum product, got in, trained up, went out, persevered, and over the course of a year to 2 years had completely changed his life. And the first time I'd heard that story, I kind of called BS on it in my mind. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, this can't be. So I asked him if he would go to lunch. Actually, I had to go to the CEO of the company and say, can I go to lunch with this guy, from a marketing standpoint? Because I wanted to see if it was for real. And it was. And he sat down and he shared the entire thing with me. And Ty, that's when I'm like, wow. In fact, I would go back to some of my buddies in the advertising marketing world, telling them about this approach to story marketing, and they kind of just rolled their eyes at me. They said, nah, yeah, that might work for network marketing, but we have to be really creative and come up with all this, these whistles and bells to sell things. And I said, I don't think you do. I think it's the power of the story. What line of work, what business was it you and your brother were running?
We had a nutritional supplement company called Pharmanex, and we were selling mostly nutritional supplements in that space. And for me, it was more than anything helped me to learn some of the skills that I think have carried me into lots of different areas of business and helped me in a huge way. I think storytelling being probably the most prominent of those. In fact, my brother still has that business. I sold my half to him, and he's still doing great with it.
Yeah. So tell me about the book, The Power of Storytelling. How did it come about?
If I'm being honest, I think that was the book I wish I had when I was 21 years old, as a young entrepreneur trying to like recognize, okay, stories work. I want to get better at this skill. I wanted to break it down. I wanted to literally like teach it as a skill. Here's the formulas. Here's what you do. Here's all of the tools, the ways that you can set this up. And I couldn't find that in the market. I don't think it's the greatest book ever written on storytelling. I'm biased. It was just named to a list of the 50 best books ever written on storytelling, but I don't know. There's probably only 50. I don't know. But what really happened for me, this wasn't my first book. My first book was called The Power of Influence. And I started speaking as a keynote speaker. And my bent as a speaker is to tell a lot of stories. And I had people who would ask me to coach them on speaking. Entrepreneurs, CEOs, salespeople, different people. And inevitably, what they were angling at was the storytelling part. And so I started doing some of that one-on-one and then kind of flushed out more and more of this material of like, what am I doing, right? Because when somebody asks you to teach what you're doing, I hadn't dissected it that way exactly. And so I did, and I started teaching people, and eventually that led to putting it together, in the book, The Power of Storytelling. And I've now spoken all over the world teaching this topic to all sorts of different groups, most of them in the sales arena, but lots of leaders, lots of fundraising professionals, entrepreneurs, lots of different groups. And story is just one of those universal skills that I think people more and more recognize its power and why they need to use it. And it's a great distinguishing mark from a leadership standpoint. We could talk about all the applications. But yeah, it came out of my own experience, but then people asking me to teach them what I was doing and how I was doing it. And so dissecting it and kind of re-engineering that skill to be able to teach it.
What do you think are some of the biggest mistakes leaders and salespeople make when they're communicating and not using storytelling?
Well, I think it's natural to go to the logical side, right? Facts and figures and some of those things. And I think those need to be there, but statistics told within the context of a story are remembered 500% better. And so I think sometimes the combination of those things are what's missing, right? We become way too logical and therefore boring. It's not emotionally moving, right? People take action based on emotion. And most people in a leadership or sales position, their job is to influence and create action from others, right? To move people to action. And so they have to recognize that emotion is the catalyst. And so we need to communicate emotionally. I think another thing that people do as they look at more facts and figures is we think that huge numbers and huge ideas have like a shock and awe effect and therefore create action. They have a shock and awe effect in terms of grabbing attention, but not in terms of creating action because they're just too big. They're hard to get our mind around. And so stories sometimes can synthesize those ideas and bring them down to an actionable state and move them forward. I think sometimes though we're trying to communicate so fast and so effectively and just as quickly as possible that we miss those opportunities for even just simple, easy stories to connect and make the message come alive a little bit, make it memorable, make it actionable, make it something that engages people a little bit more. It doesn't have to be, when I say storytelling, it doesn't mean that you're adding 10 minutes, of this huge, long, drawn out story. It could be just these little anecdotes, but they add something to the messaging.
Do you have an example of a leader you've worked with where they were definitely being driven by logic and reason in their communications, and you showed them how to use story, and when they used story, the impact it had on their audience?
Yeah, definitely. A couple of things come to mind. I mean, just this is more general, but I've worked with so many leaders who come from like more of the engineering, science-based type mindset, right? And where I'm asked to come in and work with them is they're typically presenting a program presenting something, and there's a lot of science behind it, and so they want to lean towards that, and like, okay, that's great. What does that mean to the individual? How does this play out, right? Where can we flush out one individual story that's going to make this something real? The other example that came to mind as you were saying that, just in terms of the power of it, I had a chance to work for several years with the Wounded Warrior Project and their speakers. And these are guys that, I mean, they're wounded warriors themselves. Their stories are incredible. And sometimes it's not even just going from no story to story, but sometimes it's taking that story and just little tweaks, little things where I'd sit with them and go, "Oh my gosh, this is so powerful. Let's just say it just this way. Like let's change this or rearrange the order." Because these guys, they're soldiers. They don't know how to tell stories, right? This is just sharing. This is what happened to me, and this is the experience. But if we can set the stage, and we can bring it out, and we can add a little dialogue or different things, all of a sudden that story becomes so powerful. Like you're sitting there, and I mean, literally, I just told them what to say, and they're repeating it back, and I've got tears in my eyes. I'm like, oh my gosh, because you can't help but get hit by that when it's told in that way.
Well, and you've got a formula for influential storytelling. Let's walk through that a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah, for sure. So the simplistic model of it is struggle to solution. Struggle to solution. Here's the thing: you hook people with the struggle, you help people with the solution. There is something in our bodies, in our DNA, that we respond to struggle, to conflict, to challenge. It naturally engages us. I think the easiest way to think about this is if you were to go to a movie. Let's say you're excited, you've seen the previews, it's supposed to be incredible. You sit down, you can't wait. You've got your drink in one hand, your popcorn in the other. But it ends up being about a guy that just merrily skips through life. No ups, no downs, no challenge, no struggle. Everything works out. We would leave and go, that is the stupidest movie I've ever seen, right? I mean, what was the point? Here's the problem. That's how we tell stories, in business especially. And I think we do it because we're afraid of vulnerability. We want to come across as powerful and in control and like we've got everything put together. The problem is, that's not real and it's not relatable. And I mean, think about most business stories, right? Most business stories all sound the same. We say, you know what, we're great and we've always been great and we'll always be great. And if you work with us, that'd be great. Right? And people are like, great. Or like, what's the point? Right? In business, you exist to solve problems, right? So what are those? Talking about that, if it's struggle to solution, here's how I think about it. If the struggle is relatable, the solution becomes credible. So going back to like my early direct sales days, if I was selling a product that to an individual, well, guess what? If I could make that struggle, like let's say it was my story or my mom's experience or somebody, whoever, if I could make that struggle relatable as I'm explaining what they were dealing with, and then to where the prospect sitting in front of me goes, yeah, I totally relate. That's exactly what I'm feeling. Then the solution becomes credible, right? Then that product provides that solution. And so I think understanding that model of struggle to solution um, helps us to recognize that we need to be real, we need to be authentic, we need to be vulnerable, and share where the transformation took place. And sometimes, that was advice from a mentor, a leader, somebody like that changed our mindset. Sometimes that's a product that comes into play that changes, our outcomes. Sometimes that's an initiative or a program that we put in place that all of a sudden can change the trajectory or the direction that the organization's going, whatever it is. But that model of struggle to solution really works.
Well, and I think the reason why it does work, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, is without conflict, you have no story. And I think the reason why that is, and all the studies I've done on storytelling, is stories are the quintessential tool of survival. It's what cavemen and cavewomen used way back in the day because that conflict or that struggle is a learning opportunity. So
Yeah.
if I was fishing yesterday down at the river and a saber-toothed tiger showed up and I gave him my saber-toothed salmon and it didn't eat me, it liked the salmon instead, I race back and I tell my cave mate, be careful. I was just down there fishing and oh my God, a saber-toothed tiger showed up, but I gave him my salmon and he liked the salmon better than me and therefore I'm back here again. Survival. That story makes sense because we learn when we are going through this challenge or this, problem that someone else has already experienced, and how did they get through it? Well, through your product or service.
As you're saying that, what came to mind is you always hear kind of that cliche idea that, adversity is what creates growth, right? But that's what you're saying. And the
Totally.
greater the
Yeah.
adversity, the greater the learning, the greater the growth, also the better the story, right? Because of that, because you create a larger contrast and therefore you can connect to it like there's more profound impact from it.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite quotes comes from Kurt Vonnegut, famous American writer, who said, "The most popular story in the world is a man gets in a hole, a man gets out of a hole. It doesn't have to be about a man, and it doesn't have to be about a hole, but people love that story."
I like that. I had a friend who used to do comedy writing for Jay Leno back in the day, and he sat in one of my sessions that I was teaching storytelling, and I taught this idea of struggle to solution. And he goes, "We used to teach the same model, basically." And I said, "Really?" And he goes, "We said it very different." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I would say, take your character, get him up in a tree, stuck, then throw rocks at him, and then get him down the tree." And I was like, "Okay." And he goes, "And the bigger the rocks, the better the story," right? Same idea.
Well, every joke is what? Setup, twist, punchline.
Yep.
That twist is the plot twist of, oh my God, what happens next? And of course, the punchline. So there's your 3-act structure of story right there.
Exactly.
So can you take us deeper in this formula for being able to tell more
For sure.
influential stories?
For sure. And you mentioned, right, there is a setup factor to it. So if you do it in 3 acts, setup, struggle, solution, I think, there's a couple of key things that happen in a setup. You kind of set the scene, you provide context, and then you introduce the struggle as quickly as possible, right? If that's the hook, you want to get there as quick as possible. And I think one mistake that people make often is we put a lot of unnecessary details before we get to the hook. I'll share a funny experience. A couple of years ago, we're sitting Thanksgiving. We have all my wife's family sitting at our house, and it's me and a couple brother-in-laws talking. And this one brother-in-law starts telling the story, and it's painful, right? Like he's not getting there. It's just tangents. And he's like, okay, so I was here and I was with it. No, was I with that guy? Just so many things that don't need to be there. And finally, my other brother-in-law interrupts him with what's going through all of our minds. He goes, "This better be a good story because this is really hard to listen to." And with that setup, sometimes we just spend so much time there, right? And those details don't really matter unless they're really pertinent to the story, right? So you hook people with the struggle. That struggle, you need to flush it out. The more detail, it's interesting in storytelling because the more specific the details, the more universally people connect to it, right? Which is opposite of how we typically think. We think that if we keep things broad, that people can relate. But that's not actually what happens, right? The specifics in that, I want people, as I'm explaining, especially if I know the audience, if it's one-on-one, there's a reason I'm using this story in particular. As I get into those details, I want them to go exactly. I want them to connect with that. You're describing my life right now. And then another key part in introducing the solution is I often remind people you don't want to be the hero of your own story. 1, because you're probably not. And 2, because it's not very relatable. And so even if it is your advice, where did you learn it? Where did that come from for you? Because it's a little bit more relatable. People can connect with it. If I, instead of saying, you know what, here's the advice I'd like to give you, but instead if I go, hey, I totally get where you're coming from. In fact, I remember early in my career struggling with the same thing. And I had a manager who one time said to me, boom, same advice, just all of a sudden the setup is something totally different. And that's the whole story, right? I just took the same piece of advice and threw it into this little 20-second story. And all of a sudden it can be received totally different. Yeah, I think those are a couple of key factors. Another thing that I always say that I think is an important piece when we go back to taking too much time in the setup is I remind people that if it's not necessary to say, it becomes necessary not to say. I'll say that again. If it's not necessary to say, it becomes necessary not to say. I don't think a story needs to be 30 seconds or 3 minutes or whatever. It needs to be however long it needs to be. But it does not need extra details. It doesn't need those unnecessary things because that's where we lose people. And so what I would encourage people to do, if you're really serious about taking this on as a skill and developing the skill set of storytelling, which I think is important for all of us, is you need to actually script out and practice and role play, maybe even record yourself and go back and listen to it, those stories, because that's where it becomes something that you can deliver in a way that's truly effective.
Yeah, and this idea about you are not the center of your story, I'm a big proponent of. Sometimes I'll get pushback and I'll ask people to tell their story, and they're going, but Park, I'm not supposed to be the center of the story. I go, well, but you've got to tell it in a way, like you just said, Ty, that your audience lives vicariously through you. So
Yeah.
they feel they are the part of the story. And as we all know, some of our best, most powerful stories are about us. We are the center of the overall explanation of what's going on, but it has to be told in such a way that your audience really understands it. And that comes down to you really understanding your audience. How do you go about creating the intel before you stand up in front of a big crowd to make sure that you are speaking from their point of view?
So I have two thoughts. One, I'll answer your question in 1 second. It just reminded me one thing I wish I would have said a second ago is I believe that you don't retell a story, you relive a story, especially when it's your own, right? And when you relive it, there's two reasons for doing that. One is you automatically invite other people in to relive it with you. You put it in present tense, right? Dialogue creates like it's actually happening, those types of things. But two, when you relive a story, many of the stories I've told thousands of times. But when I relive the story, it allows me to experience the emotion and therefore deliver it as if it's the first time. And so that becomes an effective tool for me as the storyteller. To your question, I want to dive in deep and do my research. So I primarily do keynote speeches for different companies, different organizations, different associations. And so we do research about them beforehand. I get on a call, sometimes multiple calls with the leadership. I ask them about I've got one particular formula we call NFV, where I ask about their needs, fears, and victories, right? I want to understand what their needs are, what their fears are, what keeps them up at night, what are their victories, where have they won, like what's the overall feeling in the organization, that kind of thing. And all of that is in preparation to get there. But then I also, once I'm there with them, I'm going around and talking to people as much as I can, introducing myself, just even if it's just getting to know a couple of individuals that I could maybe shout out or connect to or bring them into some of the messaging. So, as much as I can, trying to understand their mindset. And it's interesting for me because I work with so many different industries. I kind of find that process fascinating because I'm curious about business and how organizations work and what's working and what's not.
So, how would you guide or coach someone who say they're in sales and they say, Ty, I'm not standing up in front of big groups, but I want to do a better job of being able to connect with that singular prospect sitting across from me, be it a Zoom session or heaven forbid, I actually show up in their office. How do you coach that?
I would do your research. I mean, anymore, you can find out stuff about people pretty easily, right? Find them on Instagram, find them on Facebook. Looked up their LinkedIn profile. You've got past experience, past employers, where they went to school, certain hobby, like all those things are really easy to find. Now, whether you choose to tie those in or not is up to you and how you do it. But you can do some research really easy. Like, give me 5 minutes in your name, and I could find out quite a bit about you, right? That's the world we live in. And so I think it's worth doing some of those things. Then the awareness of just looking around, right? If I come in and sit down in your office, there's typically things that are important to you, right? Things that I can engage you with. If you have a picture of your family over there, if you've got, a helmet of the New York Jets or like whatever it is, right? Those are easy conversation things. And I believe that, talking to people in terms of what their interests is an easy and important process to be able to engage them. So, yeah, I would do some of that stuff very quickly. Deeper research, obviously, depending on, what you're selling and what that looks like. If you can dive into it even deeper, connect with people or, that are connected with them, start to understand what their needs are, that kind of thing. Everybody's going to have their own process for that, but I think it's just laziness if we don't do any kind of research beforehand.
Well, and how else are you going to place your audience at the center of the story
Yeah.
if you don't understand them?
Yep.
You got to know them inside and out as best you can. What do you tell people? And I'm sure you hear this as I do a lot. Ty, I don't have any stories. Nobody wants to hear my stories. Don't make me tell a story. How do you encourage them to overcome that fear of storytelling?
You know, it's so funny when you said that. I remember years ago, I was sitting in a church class in Indiana with my father-in-law, and the guy who was teaching was teaching from a sermon that somebody else gave, and that sermon didn't use a lot of stories. And he specifically pointed that out. He said, you know, this guy doesn't really ever use a lot of stories. His background as a lawyer. He's, you know, pretty straightforward. And these a couple people started talking about that, and we're like, I kind of like it. It's kind of nice, just to, you know, it's straightforward. Sometimes stories feel like fluff, and my father-in-law just keeps kind of glancing at me, right, as they're having this conversation about storytelling. And he finally interrupts and he goes, you know, my son-in-law sitting right here wrote a book on storytelling. I think it sold, I don't know how many copies, like 300,000 copies, and he's spoken all over the world teaching storytelling. Ty, what do you think about storytelling? And I was like, it just kind of put me on the spot. I was like, yeah, I think storytelling matters. It works. And the pushback you get from people all the time, like, yeah, I don't have huge stories. You don't need huge stories. It's every single person has stories to tell. Typically, what I find is they don't know how to tell them. That's the key, because some of the stories that are most impactful are just little insights, right? I mean, I tell stories on stage of like an insight my 3-year-old gave me. Like, it's
Mhm.
not profound, it's not earth shattering, it's cutesy. But if you tell it well, you can learn how to engage people, and there's a reason for telling those types of stories. I also would tell people that the more personal a story is, the more powerful it becomes. So you can obviously tell other people's stories. You could tell a story from history or those types of things. And sometimes there's a need for that or a reason for that, and they can be powerful. But if you can tell your own story, it's even better. Because of that, you know, I don't think it needs to be huge. I think it just needs to be yours.
Well, I had kind of an aha moment a few years ago when I was working with this very type A sales group, a medical device group out of Chicago, and there were 62 professionals I was teaching in there. And after going through it, 2 modules of my course, I had them start coming back and saying, Park, I'm afraid of this. I
Mhm.
don't think I have a story to tell. I don't know, this storytelling thing is too big for me to get my head wrapped around, which I was really surprised of because they were very accomplished salespeople. They just weren't using stories. And it occurred to me, in fact, that the person that hired me said, Park, we have to reframe this storytelling thing. And what I did is came back and said, don't worry about the story. Just take us to a moment in time when something happened, something
Yeah.
changed that you can relate to. Share with us that story. When did it happen? Where did it happen? Who is the central character that this happened to? What happened? The surprising outcome that leads to your business point or your sales point. And Ty, just by simply doing that little reframing, don't tell me a story. Just tell me about a moment when something happened. It completely opened their eyes and they became much more comfortable with their own stories.
Yeah, because of that model we talked about, struggle to solution, one of the exercises I've done with people is I've had them sit down and write out every time there's been struggle in their life. Right? Just come at it from that standpoint, because a good story always has struggle. Now, does every struggle lead to a good story? No, right? They like, when did you have bad customer service? When did you fight with somebody? When did you like have a bad boss? Like, let's go through all the struggle, and out of that, sometimes, you know, spend 10 minutes and fill up a page. There might be a handful of good stories out of that, right? Key lessons learned, right? And but it is sometimes hard too to just think, okay, what's a story that I have, right? Our mind doesn't just generate it. So I like coming at it from that a different angle.
Yeah. Well, I know we don't have a lot of time left here with you, so let's boil it down to the lightning round. If you're
Okay.
sitting across from someone and they're saying, Ty, what are the 3 things I can be thinking of or doing right now to become better with my storytelling? What would you tell them?
First off, just being cognizant, being aware of it, trying to use stories as often as possible. Two, carry with you some kind of way of capturing stories. As you're aware of that, when stuff happens, just start writing it down. Okay, this is an idea. There's here. Oh, I remembered this. This is something I could use potentially. That's an interesting analogy. Let's flush that out, right? Capture some of those ideas. And then 3, as you do it, record yourself. That seriously, it is so painful, but there's nothing better in the whole world than hearing what it actually sounds like, how you come across to people. And go back and listen to it. You don't have to share it with anybody. You don't have to post it on YouTube. Just record yourself and then go back and listen to it. That will give you more awareness of how you actually come across than anything else you can do.
Role playing with yourself.
Yeah.
What about auditioning your stories for your friends, families, neighbors, colleagues,
Sure.
whoever? Just go out and retell it to a lot of different people in different ways and see which one lands.
Yeah, I mean, you think about any speaker, comedian, etc. They're always testing material. I do that same thing, right? I'll throw in this new story and be like, and see how people react to it. What parts do they laugh? What parts do they light up? Okay, I'm on the right track, but I haven't quite tweaked it, right? And then if you record that too, listen to it, go back and listen to it. But yeah, seeing how people respond to material is one of the best ways to do it.
Yeah. Well, Ty, thank you so much for being here. I know you're a busy guy. Where can people learn more about you and get your book?
I'm pretty easy to find at tybennett.com or Ty Bennett on any social media. Yeah, great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me and fun discussion.
Yeah. And Happy New Year, man.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard, please share this episode with anyone you know who would like to grow their influence through storytelling. If you're ready to start building your storytelling muscles, then take our ABTs of Agile Communications micro-learning course at businessofstory.com/ABT. Or if you want to help your team grow as confident, compelling, and persuasive storytellers, then by all means, shoot me a note to park@businessofstory.com. I would be happy to help you through in-person or hybrid trainings, whatever works best for you and yours. Our show is produced by Caden Howell, music composed by Darius Holbert, and community development and marketing is by Marissa Hill. I hope you'll join me next Monday when former HP international marketer Stephen Winkler will share his approach to visual storytelling and the impact he has had humanizing high-tech marketing. Until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one epic. Thanks so much for listening.